Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be looking at how to complete a simple watercolor technique grid. We're going to be looking at 12 different techniques that you can use with watercolor. And as you can see here, I'm just going back and making sure my tape is firmly pressed down because I don't want the paint leaking under the tape. So we have 12 boxes set up. The first one we're going to be looking at is a technique called dry brush. And dry brush is basically just taking a mostly dry paintbrush and just having it skim across the tops of the texture of your paper. So you know that there's a tooth to the paper, and when we're applying dry brush, we just want to be skipping over the tops so that the valleys of the paper are not getting filled with paint. So it gives you a freckled kind of appearance, or like a dashed line. The second technique is called wet on dry. This is what you're probably most familiar with if you are somebody who just likes to dive into creating a watercolor painting. So with this technique, you're simply making your brush damp, and you're mixing your paints in the lid of your palette, and then you're applying it to the dry paper. With this strategy, you get some nice crisp details depending on how much water you add to your paints. So with watercolor, there's really two key points. One is you have more control if you are using less water. And then the second one is you need to time yourself accordingly. So wait for things to dry before adding more details. People often rush and then they get frustrated because they are trying to work on something that is just too wet. The next technique, I'm just prepping the surface. So the next one is wet on wet. So I'm just going to go in with a wet brush and move it across the paper just to make sure that it's kind of starting to soften while I finish up the details on the dry, on the wet on dry, number 2. So you can see that with less water, you have greater precision and you can do more detail work. When we move on to the next one, the wet on wet, you'll see that when you add color onto wet paper, like that's been pre-moistened, you'll get a looser look. Both are perfectly valid as watercolor techniques go, as they all are that we're going to be going over. But certain times you'll want to use the wet on dry paper, and then there are probably other times when you would want to use a technique where you get more of a hazy effect like this wet on wet. So with wet on wet, your paper has already been gone over with either a wet sponge or you've gone over it with a wet paintbrush like I did here. And then you're just adding your colors and letting them blur and fade however they want to. So with this, there's less control and you get some unpredictable results, but it's great for things like fog or making things look like they're in the background. So here I am going back to the second one with some dots for the center of the flower. And as you let your paper dry, that's when you can really go back and add more detail as you want. And these, of course, are just practice examples. So they're just, kind of quick experiments. So don't be alarmed that the quality of these is not great. They're just to kind of test out the techniques. So as that wet on wet paper starts to dry out, you'll get more crisp detail that is mimicking wet on dry. So now we're going to move on to the next one, a flat wash. So here I am holding a flat brush. When you're applying paint, there are many different shapes of brushes, but a flat brush is going to give you a much more even wash than, say, a typical round brush. So a flat wash sounds pretty straightforward. You're just applying color so that you don't have any streaks, but it's actually quite difficult and requires some practice. Number 5, a gradient, is getting a value scale basically just by applying more water as you go. So where you have more color at the top, that's getting blended with more water as it fades down. Number 6, a variegated wash, is the same kind of thing as a gradient, except you want to leave a gap between two colors, give it a wiggle, and it will start to spread and form a third new color between those two. And you can repeat this as many times as you want to get a rainbow effect. So number 7, negative painting. I'm going to start out by just painting the background yellow and letting that dry completely. This is optional. You don't have to paint anything in the background to do this technique, but that's the way I'm going to just approach this one. So I'm going to wait for that to dry. Moving on, we're going to start number 8. And for number 8, we want to apply some water just around the outer edge because we're trying to do a fade or dissolve. So we want the inside to be dry paper, and we're going to be doing a wet on dry technique for the inside, but the outside is going to be a wet on wet. So we want the background to be kind of blurry and then the center to be nice and crisp. So we're kind of combining technique number 2 and technique number 3 to get one image that has both strategies. So when you're doing this, you can start with the background, and again, leaving the center of that square dry, and adding in some kind of hazy, fuzzy details on top of the pre-wet paper. Then as you move towards the center, you're working on dry paper, so you'll be getting more detailed and in focus looking flowers or whatever you choose to do. You can add other colors if you need to. You can layer on top, but just keep in mind that if your paper is dry, it's no longer going to give you that nice hazy effect that you would get with wet on wet, because your paper needs to be wet in order for that to happen. So getting back to the negative space painting, number 7, so the yellow has dried, and now I'm just going back in and adding in some random shapes. And what we're going to be doing for this strategy is painting in the background to create the foreground. Or we're painting in the negative spaces around the objects to create the objects. So where I'm using blue and I've already have a layer of yellow painted, it's going to be kind of a greeny background, so I'm going to have to do a couple layers of blue to get it to be more of a blue and less of a green, because the yellow wants to merge with the blue and make a green. Number 9, layering. This is where you are laying down some color and letting it dry completely so that you can go back to it and either add textures or other colors on top, or create more detail. So for this example, I'm just going to do some stripes and let them dry, and then we'll go back to it and add some horizontal stripes on top. So while you're waiting for that to dry, you can move on to number 10. And number 10 is that controversial technique of a color bloom. Some people love it, other people think that is a flaw with watercolors. So the strategy for this is to have uneven wet and dry areas. So what's going to happen here is when you paint on with your watercolors, if you use a few different colors and you create kind of like these bands of color and you have some gaps between them where there's some dry paper, as soon as you go back with a wet paintbrush and kind of just dab on water droplets, the color is going to want to flow and follow gravity and do its own thing. And that's where you get your color blooms. Number 11, masking fluid. Masking fluid you have to prepare in advance and let it dry completely so that it's a almost like a latex rubber. So when you paint on top of masking fluid, I recommend using darker colors so that it has some contrast to the white areas that you're reserving by using the masking fluid, but you can use any color. So painting over directly over that masking fluid, we're going to let that dry completely and then go back and peel the masking fluid off later to reveal the white of the paper. So the masking fluid almost acts like masking tape, where it's reserving some areas that are white. So back to number 9, layering. That's dried enough to go back and add a second layer. Now we're just going to add some horizontal stripes, and it's going to create a new color, provided you don't apply too much paint like I did, for that first horizontal bar. So as you can see, every time I add a horizontal stripe, the color that's underneath gets affected and they optically merge together. So the last technique here is salt. Salt is a technique where you're relying on the salt to soak up or slurp up the watercolor that's still wet so that the area around the salt crystal goes back to being a lighter color, because the salt crystal has kind of slurped up the color and the water. You can also do this technique with dry rice, because rice is very absorbent and it will, again, soak up the color. So with salt, you just sprinkle it on while the painting is still wet, and it does have to be pretty wet for this to work. And obviously the bigger salt crystals you use, the more it will draw up the color and be more absorbent. So this is just an overview looking at where it's at while it's still wet. You can see the color bloom starting to form. The negative painting needs another layer. The fade dissolve, again, blurry in the background, tighter in the middle. The gradient and the variegated and the wash are very straightforward. The wet on wet, you can see how much it pooled and moved around, and then the dry brush is where we started. So now that it's dry, it's time to peel the masking fluid off. If you leave your masking fluid on for more than a week, it can be a little difficult to peel it off the paper, just because the longer it sits there, the longer it has to really get into the fibers of the paper. So this would have been easier to peel off had I done it sooner. So you can see where the masking fluid is removed, it goes back to being just the white of the paper because it repelled the paint. So this is a great material to use in conjunction with your watercolor if you don't want to paint around small areas. Like if you were doing this without masking fluid, you would be painting the blue and the purple and the black around each one of those little dots. And that would be really time consuming, and you wouldn't get the same kind of detail that you can with the masking fluid. So once that's all removed, you'll just be left with a white kind of silhouette of your image. As an option, you can go back in and add your other colors. Usually you would do you use masking fluid if your background is dark and your subject is a lighter color. So you're reserving the white by doing the masking fluid, and then you're adding your lighter colored subject on top of your dark background. So the last step before we label this is to remove the tape. So this is a very satisfying part of the process because you get nice crisp lines as you peel back your masking tape. If you're using blue painter's tape, it comes away really easily. If you're using a cream colored masking tape, it's recommended that you first press it against your jeans or your sweatshirt, just so that it's not as sticky, because it can pull at the paper. So our next step is just to label this. And here's our finished product. Here we have our 12 techniques, and thanks for joining me.